President Trump moments ago doubling down on his social media post, saying that he has directed 2 American nuclear submarines toward Russian water.
We had to do that. We just have to be careful. And a threat was made, and we didn't think it was appropriate, so I have to be very careful. So I do that on the basis of safety for our people. A threat was made by a former president of Russia, and we're going to protect our people.
All right, the threat that he is referring to does come from the former Russian president, also now currently very senior in the Russian Defense Department, Dmitry Medvedev. He is now the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council. And Medvedev said, and I quote, "Let Trump remember his favorite films about the walking dead, as well as how dangerous a dead hand that does not exist in nature can be." Now, the dead hand is a reference to Russia's dead hand system. Basically, even if you knock everybody out with a nuclear strike, the Kremlin is destroyed, the system will automatically fire back. That's the dead hand pushing the button. And it comes as Russian President Vladimir Putin tonight said this.
Russia isn't capturing territory. We are returning what's rightfully ours.
I want to go straight to Natasha Bertrand. She's at the Pentagon, and our Nick Payton Walsh, who is right now on the ground in Kyiv, both with us on this breaking news on this Friday. And Natasha, Trump doubling down on this, right? Sending nuclear submarines towards Russia. Obviously, when you think about the context here, what Putin's saying, this couldn't come at a more fraught time.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very thinly veiled threat, not only by Medvedev, but also by President Trump. And it's maybe an empty one because we don't actually know where these submarines are. And that is by design. We may never know because their location at any given time is one of the most closely held secrets by the U.S. military officials. That is why the location of these submarines is very rarely publicly discussed. But, you know, we also don't know what kind of submarines President Trump is talking about. All of the Navy's submarines are nuclear power, but only about 14 of them can actually carry nuclear warheads. So that is unclear as well. But they are regularly carrying out these kinds of patrols in international waters, and they can hit targets thousands of miles away. So if President Trump really wanted to order some kind of strike on the Russians, then he could have done that without telegraphing this publicly, of course, without even having to move them any closer to Russia than they perhaps already are as part of their routine patrols. But at the very least, this is a very clear message to the Russians at a very sensitive moment between Washington and Moscow because of the tensions over these peace talks with the Ukrainians that are simply not materializing because President Putin continues, of course, to ignore President Trump's entreaties to come to the table here, Aaron.
And Nick, you know, as you know, and you're on the ground in Kyiv tonight, Medvedev thrives on provocation, right? Dire nuclear threats, right? Which are not nothing, but most world leaders dismiss them as real threats. But Trump tonight doing something different, right? Wanting to publicly acknowledge it, even though he has ignored some of Medvedev's past threats of nuclear Armageddon. So, you know, when you take that, plus what we're hearing from Putin today, right? What he said, Putin today, he talked about, Nick, it was, quote, taking back what's rightfully ours. Certainly seeming to imply why do a ceasefire if he could go ahead and continue to win militarily in Ukraine. So how is this playing out on the front line?
Yeah, I mean, it's utterly bizarre that Medvedev, someone who's been kind of tuned out, frankly, for the last 3.5 years, whenever he makes particularly wide-ranging apocalyptic threats as just somebody who doesn't have agency within the Kremlin, is the one who sparks this unprecedented, frankly, public discussion of American nuclear assets by a US president, something, frankly, that never happens and you wouldn't really expect to hear from the White House. Clearly, Trump feeling he has to escalate back, not wanting the Kremlin to feel they can idly threaten the United States. So that leads us into a very complex week ahead, because on August the 8th, just under 7 days from now, Trump has to decide to implement the sanctions against Russian and allies' energy consumers that he's threatened if, as it seems, Putin doesn't come to a sudden peace agreement, and Putin himself returning to his maximalist demands, saying that they're taking back what's rightfully theirs is the Russian narrative that Ukraine doesn't really exist as a country that led to the invasion in February 2022. He's going back back to those wider ideas, not shifting in the slightest. And earlier today saying Trump's disappointment in him is down to unrealistic expectations. Look, Putin was clear they're having success on the front lines. It's something we've seen over the last week's reporting along the eastern front line. He's confident that will indeed continue. And so there's no sign at all, frankly, from the words we're hearing in Moscow that any kind of successful peace is imminent. And so that makes this odd, weird nuclear bluster we've just heard, coupled with a week ahead of that deadline next weekend, so incredibly fraught and important. But some Ukrainians, frankly, will hear this and think, this is the United States, potentially suggesting military involvement here or talk back to Moscow, and that will lift hearts here. Aaron?
Yeah, sometimes the rhetoric of the U.S. using the word nuclear, that rhetoric alone, as you point out, unprecedented, and that may be what matters most. Thank you both so much.
The President of the United States today rattled the nuclear saber against Russia, writing on social media, quote, "I've ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be positioned in the appropriate regions just in case these foolish and inflammatory statements are more than just that." The president was referring to comments from former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, referring to Russia's so-called dead hand system, which could automatically retaliate if an enemy were to launch a strike on Russia.
He was talking about nuclear. When you talk about nuclear, we have to be prepared, and we're totally prepared.
Joining us now is former NATO Supreme Allied Commander General Wesley Clark and CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger. Good to have you both here tonight. General Clark, is this an appropriate response, assuming that the president did what he said he did, and that is move nuclear submarines in response to a remark on social media?
Actually, it probably feeds the Russian disinformation plan because it raises the temperature, scares people that there might be a nuclear, and that's what Russia's been trying to do all along, is scare people about nuclear. No, if you want an effective response, you push the weapons into Ukraine. And instead, they've been slowed to a trickle. Yeah. So, this is just rhetoric, but it's rhetoric that he may think it makes him look strong and tough in front of some supporters, but actually it works against us and in favor of Russia.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting if he does this, but doesn't, for instance, impose the sanctions he's promised to do in a week or so's time. David, if one follows Dmitry Medvedev on social media, as I do, you can see, and I'm sure you know as well, that this is not an isolated comment. He tends to make quite incendiary claims on social media. Do folks in the national security space here in the U.S. take those comments seriously?
They don't, Jim. I mean, you'll remember that Medvedev was the guy who stood in as president of Russia when Putin was term limited and spent a few years out of power and then came back in after Medvedev was there. I met him once or twice during that time, and he at that moment was sounding relatively reasonable, telling jokes, did not seem out of the mainstream, also didn't seem to have very much power. These days, he's turned into, and really since the invasion of Ukraine, into an incredibly hot-headed internet troll who sits on the National Security Committee but does not really have any power. And what's interesting to me here is the president decided to rise to the bait because, you and I have both written about nuclear saber rattling that's taken place since the Ukraine war started, but it was all in the other direction, right? It was Putin threatening to use nuclear weapons either publicly or moving them around as he did in October of 2022. We haven't seen it from the U.S., and that's what made this different.
Yeah, you and I wrote about that time in the fall of 2022 when the U.S. was quite concerned that Russia might use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. So, General Clark, to you, I suppose the concern in cycles of escalation, right, is that it's what's happening and it's what the other side believes is happening, right? And they might not always be right. They might over or underreact. Does this create the conditions potentially for, I'm not saying escalation right up to a nuclear exchange, but to worrisome responses to each of these movements in both directions?
Well, I think Medvedev is a provocateur operating on Mr. Putin's instructions. And I think it's a long series of these statements designed to intimidate the West, to not help us to rationalize not supporting Ukraine. And so when we play into it with the nuclear submarine maneuvers, we're playing into that Russian information game. But if you really want to move toward a ceasefire and toward a resolution, the only way to do it's on the ground. Yeah. And that is, you've got to stop the Russian advance cold. And you've got to convince Mr. Putin he's going to lose. And he should stop right now, because he's going to lose more if he continues. Now, if you're not willing to do that, if you're afraid of doing that, he's going to continue to issue provocative statements. He's going to continue to say, oh, let's talk about peace. And he's going to send people forward. He's got 30,000 North Korean troops lined up behind Pokrovsk. He's got a new front he's opening around Sumy. And the big punch will come toward Mykolaiv and Odessa sometime in September.
Right.
Now, that's the Russian game plan. That's what they've been working on. And all of the rest of the stuff is just it's just nonsense. The sanctions are not going to stop that machine from coming forward.
Okay.
So we've got a few weeks to do more on the ground. That's it.
So on that question, David, are those sanctions going to happen this time around? Because as you know, it's not the first time Trump has set a deadline. Question, of course, is does he enforce this deadline?
So these are very effective sanctions if they get implemented. But to implement them, you basically have to say that you're going to penalize China, India, and Turkey, three countries that are buying oil from the Russians, but which the president's got other big interests in. And I think the big question here is he really willing to face off against those three? And I have my doubts, but maybe in a week we'll find out.
We'll be watching. General Clark, David Sanger, thanks so much to both of you. Hope you have a good weekend.